Hello, everyone. You do not want to be backstage during a contest with this group. Welcome to the known unknowns of the 2020 election. We have an extraordinary panel with a breadth of experience and expertise. They have shaped strategy and tactics for presidential candidates and for American presidents, including Bush's 41 and 43, Clinton, Obama, Clinton. Two have served in significant roles in the White House, and all have had a hand in shaping platforms and policies. And while they're certainly prominent political figures, some of their prominence has bled over into the world of pop culture. One of them, their character has been in an Academy Award-nominated movie, although we need to talk about that casting because it should have been George Clooney. Just saying, Joseph Beck is a fine actor. And then another is appearing in a play on Broadway. One of them has been famously called the architect, but they are all architects of the modern political campaign and uniquely well positioned to help guide us through the unknowns of what we're heading into. So Neera Tanden, Karl Rove, Mark Penn, Jim Messina, welcome. I want to start by we're going to spend the bulk of this hour talking about the American political campaign, the American political system. But given what we are seeing in the world, and given your expertise outside of the US, I'm wondering if you could start by putting what we are seeing here with the fragmentation of parties, with the increased polarization, with the rise of nationalism, with the spread between the rural poor and the urban elites in an international context. What are you seeing around the world that is similar and what's different? And maybe, Jim, I'll start with you.
Yeah, perfect. So I've worked for 7 or 8 presidents and prime ministers around the world, and what you're seeing in all around the world is the rise of the 3rd and 4th and 5th political parties. You see presidents winning who aren't part of major parties. You know, Macron in France, Macri in Argentina, the new president of Mexico, 5 stars in Italy. And what it really is an economic anger about what the future is, and people are splintering outside of major parties, trying to find new avenues to hear their voices. That anger, it manifests itself in several different ways. You see the populism in Europe right now, mostly on the right about immigration. You see that here as well. The only place, interestingly enough, you don't see the rise of these parties is the United States of America. Because of our electoral college, we are a 2-party system. But you feel that inside the primaries now. And really there are 2 wings of both major political parties that are at absolute war with each other internally. You're going to see that more prominently in my primary. Neera and Mark and I are having an interesting Democratic primary with approximately 700 candidates for president.
We'll get to that in a moment. Yes, indeed.
Sadly, I've met with all of them, and I can tell you the goods and the bads. But, you know, and you saw it in the last election with President Trump. Those of us, you know, I think Karl, who is my favorite Republican in America, would not think that the Republican president of the United States would be a protectionist, anti-trade Republican, yet now we have a president who is. And that change inside the primaries is really driving politics, and it's why, in part, we have such polarization. But to your point, I advised Prime Minister May and have been watching the Brexit fights. And that Brexit rise of anger, economic anxiety, is the same thing that propelled Donald Trump. It is the same thing that just got AMLO elected in Mexico. It is just showing itself different ways in different places, but it's the same rise of this anger and nationalism.
So, Neera, I'm wondering who benefits from this rising anger?
Well, I mean, the people who can capitalize on that anger. So I think adding to what Jim said, I think that there's a both economic anxiety about it, but we also should recognize that what feeds it is both culture, race, immigration, other issues. So if you look around the world, just to add, you have UKIP in England, you have the National Front in France, you have the National League in Italy, you have the Alliance for Germany in Germany. All of them are focused, what holds them together actually is opposition to immigration. within the European Union, they are very focused on national sovereignty. And obviously, there are a lot of connections here in the United States to Trump's focus on immigration as well. I would say one of the things that we also see is that Macron was able to, I mean, he's obviously having domestic challenges now, but in his election, he was able to push back on and have a decisive victory because he had another vision of change. There were two parties that represented change. Macron created En Marche. It was very different from the Social Democrats. So he was able to articulate an argument about change. And I think that is something that's important in our elections, which is if my basic take on the world is everyone is looking for change because there is anger at the status quo because it is not delivering results. And so an opportunity for the Democratic Party is to think through how it makes the argument of change against Donald Trump, who is still, a pretty disruptive political figure.
So turning to the US election, this is the most important election of our lifetime. Hyperbole or just the facts? Carl?
Well, every election is the most important one. That's what we always say in order to gin up the donors and the volunteers. So it is the most important election in our nation's history. And it'll be held next week, the West Lake Hills Independent School District Board of Trustees election. I want to agree with the two previous observations that economic populism is roiling the democratic world, but I don't think that's the only thing that's happening. There's not one cause fits all bad problems. In some parts of Europe, rank corruption has been a problem, and particularly in the developing world and Latin America, the idea that your government is basically stealing from you and stealing from the future of your country is driving a lot of this animus. And there's also a sense that the elites have gotten out of touch with ordinary people, that there are a bunch of people in charge of the government, whether it's in, fill in the blank, who are looking down their nose as France. This is driving the yellow vest people. Are you listening to us? You're the smart, well-educated elite who are looking down on us. And I think this all goes back to something that is hard to address and is of all of these things are the most troubling to me, which is the decline in trust in the institutions of government. If you look at the United States, the Congress is the worst it's been since 1974. The presidency is low. But the only two institutions in our society that have maintained the respect of the American people are law enforcement and the military. And you can't have a free society if those are the only people you trust. The Supreme Court's sort of relatively high, but at a low level compared to where it's been. And how you reinstitute confidence and trust here in the United States is probably an easier thing to ultimately settle than how do you restore confidence and trust in institutions of government that either have been ruining their reputations for decades, Italy, or are new and have little in the way of democratic traditions.
So people are angry, they're distrustful of institutions that have not been working for them. Is Joe Biden right when he says this election is a battle for the soul of America?
Well, obviously the soul of America is at stake, but let me kind of put in context your question about international and kind of what's playing out here. There are two major forces affecting all elections, technology and globalism. And that means then all elections here and elsewhere then become about leaders who are either nationalist or internationalist and are about the new economy or the old economy. So if you think of Barack Obama, he was a new economy internationalist. If you think of Donald Trump, he is an old economy nationalist. Those two forces, propelled by primarily older voters who didn't want to let go of the society that they knew, right, gave him the victory. If I look around the world, I could classify every president. I might take Modi in India and say he's a new economy nationalist. But every leader falls basically on these two types. And so in America now, we fight out between the Silicon Valley voters, represented by the coasts, and the old economy voters, represented primarily in the Midwest. The old economy voters won. So is it anger? It's tension. If you're half the people and you're living on a third of the GDP, You think, hey, I'm being passed by. And the truth of the matter is they were. And so they asserted their power. Now, Joe Biden is going to come along and say, hey, you don't need an old economy nationalist. I can still represent the new economy and the old values that you like and try to take back the working class voters that Donald Trump stole from the Democratic Party. If he can do that, he wins. If he doesn't, he loses.
So when we look ahead to what will be different in 2020, let's think a little bit about what are the demographic changes. If we're having this debate, right, of these two sides of the equation, as you said, what are the demographic changes that are driving this? You call this a 40-40-20 election.
Yeah, if you want to put up slide 1, right? So about 140 million people voted in the last election. We have about 90 million more who are eligible to vote. And we are now in what I call a 40-40-20 country, right? 40% Donald Trump is chewing gum, he should be impeached. 40% on the other side, Hillary Clinton is chewing gum, she should be jailed, okay? And so there's 20%, if you look through the poll questions, that swing back and forth and genuinely look at the issues. They're the quiet people in the focus groups, they decide everything. So if you're a campaign strategist now, there's about 30 million swing voters, half of them in swing states. You can spend $1 gazillion, and you will today spend $1 gazillion trying to convert them over. And they will be middle income, middle-aged, suburban and ex-urban voters. There's also 94 million people, about a third of them in swing votes, who are just outside the political system, eligible, but they don't vote. And you can instead say, hey, give me my slice of those couch potato voters who are actually mostly downscale whites. Tremendous numbers of Latinos are outside the political system. Most Asians are outside. It's fascinating if we had more time. One other quick demographic thing I'll show you, slide 2. Why do we have such, no, that's not slide 2. Try slide 2. So why do we have candidates in their 60s, 70s, and maybe presidents in their 80s? Because if you came down and looked at the marketing in this country, you would say, aha, this is a country of people under 35, people in millennials and Gen Z. Well, the truth is the country's never been older. And so the fastest growing group is in fact older people. When John F. Kennedy was elected, 18 to 29s outnumbered those over 65 2-1. Today it's about even. If you take 60 as a cutoff, in fact, there are far more people over the age of 60 than in the younger generation. And that population will continue to grow astronomically. So why are these candidates winning? Older voters are driving both the pocketbook and in fact, the voting economy today, far more so than anyone realizes.
So Jim, I'm immersed in the world of Gen Z. And I think this is an extraordinary generation of young people.
Yep.
They are now heading to the polls. What role will, despite Mark's analysis of older voters are driving this, what role will Gen Z be playing in this election?
In the 2018 midterm elections, we had the highest midterm election turnout in 100 years.
Yeah.
The next presidential election is likely going to be the highest presidential turnout in 100 years. In part, Mark's numbers are right with older voters, but it's in part the young voters really getting involved in voting in record numbers.
If we bring up slide 3 to you.
The interesting thing about these voters are they're 500% more likely to be involved in politics than their parents' generation. People under 30 are more involved in politics than any generation ever, in part because of technology. They're doing it on their cell phones, they're doing it in social groups, they're doing it with their friends, and in part because they understand that they have more to lose and are more politically active. That combination of technology and young people is starting to really change the demography of some of these states. When we get to the states, we start talking about states that are getting whiter and older, like Ohio, that is getting more difficult for Democrats, and states that are getting younger and more diverse, like Colorado and Nevada, that's getting easier. And in part, you can just track these older versus younger voter numbers to figure out how these states are moving.
So will this election be about persuasion or turnout?
Yes.
Percentages, please.
Well, look, anybody who thinks an election is about one or the other is an idiot. They're about both. I remember in 2004, the Democrats were going to beat
But that
Bush.
was me who asked it was going to be about.
No, moderators are never in that category.
Wait,
One of my
I think-
colleagues here on the panel who are brilliant, each and every one of them. But look, you know, Jim didn't run the re-election for Obama by simply saying, okay, we're going to turn out the Democrats. Every election is about both things. And both things need to be done to an extraordinary level. And the idea that, oh, in 2004, this was the conceit of Americans coming together. We're going to go out and spend $140 million and turn out the Democratic vote and beat Bush. Well, that assumed that Bush wasn't going to try and turn out the vote. He gets 25% more votes in 2004 than he got in 2000. It wasn't an accident, because we had an emphasis both on persuasion. He's the guy who kept us safe, and his opponent is a flip-flopping Massachusetts liberal. But we also did turnout. So every election is that, and if you don't do both, you're going to lose.
Hey, Carl, can I ask a question about that? No.
Maybe not.
No. You and I both agree. We both ran re-election campaigns for presidents and focused on both, and I totally agree. But you and I would probably agree that President Trump has yet to really do much on swing voters, that he spends almost all of his time talking to his base.
Yeah.
And I think that's a recipe for losing the next election. And I wonder if you do too, and whether you agree with my question.
Well, if you bothered to read my brilliant Wall Street Journal columns, you would have seen, for example, that was one of my points about Bernie Sanders. I wrote this column a couple weeks ago where I said if Republicans are not careful, I mean, they delude themselves. Oh, he's a socialist. Nobody's going to vote for him. If he's our opponent, we win. Easy. No. Every election is about persuasion and turnout.
Right.
It was
and
just after
you
the
have to
prediction.
You have to conduct a campaign based around aimed at those swing voters. My only disagreement with Mark's first slide is I'm not certain it's 20%.
I have your slide 5. I was paying attention to your Wall Street Journal column.
Thank you.
We'll see.
Thank you.
There's a slide.
Unlike Messina, who hurt my feelings.
Slide 5, the dueling headlines. The dueling Bernie headlines.
You
Or
really,
not.
You really do have influence over
I know.
people running the slides, don't you?
But
Clearly not.
can I just
It's up there. It's
in.
behind you.
get a comment back with? So when we ran the '96 election, we ran it primarily for swing voters.
Yeah.
And I think the goal was get President Clinton above 50, get the swing voters who never voted for him, go after soccer moms who were a new constituency at the time. And it doesn't mean, as you said, hey, we're not going to get the turnout, but there is a primary emphasis. And when you make the emphasis on swing voters, you're always pitching to people who don't agree with you. So when you win a primarily swing voter election, the country unites. And I'd say Barack Obama in 2008 ran an election like that. When you run an election primarily geared towards turnout, you're talking only to your own base, and you get elected, but you don't unify the country. And I would say, frankly, your re-election was more about turnout than it was swing voters. And I would say Trump staying at 45 is all about the base. And yet a candidate who wins primarily on swing voters will unify the country, and we need more elections that do that.
So I think this is actually a central part of the Democratic argument within the primary, right? So I would note between
There's your
these
headline, Bob.
I would note between these two headlines, there has been a few results in polling over the last couple of hours, which indicated one of our colleagues seemed more right about what the future of the Democratic Party than the other. But
So you don't think I'm right? You think there's no chance at all Bernie Sanders could win?
I think Democrats are focused like a laser beam on electability because Donald Trump is so anathema to their views, and that is fueling the rise of Biden, who in a range of polls today, 3 different polls, is nearing 40%. And a few candidates, including Sanders, is falling behind from where they were. But I actually think this debate about how to run a general election is permeating the Democratic primary because there are a series of candidates. Biden, O'Rourke, Buttigieg, who are making an argument about trying to unify the country, to have an election and a candidacy which can actually speak to Democrats, Republicans, and independents. And then there are candidates who argue that essentially Trump went to his base, and the best way to win is to electrify the alternative base. Bernie Sanders is making a little bit of that argument, I would say. So I actually think this question of how to, in a sort of unusual way, because Trump is such a focus within the Democratic primary in a way that I haven't seen in previous races, I think this question of how to run. But I actually think what's fascinating is lots of Democrats, lots of very progressive Democrats are actually moving towards candidates who can make an argument that they can actually appeal to moderates.
Yeah, like 61% of Democrats say the most important issue in the primary is who can beat Donald Trump.
Yes.
That's why I don't, Neera and I have had a lot of fun bashing Bernie Sanders on national television recently. And
I didn't do that.
Right.
That was just Jim.
right.
Oh, yes, you did.
And he
Come
hates
on.
Neera and respects
Come on.
me. No, but a couple other things that I think are matter, because I'm going to agree with Carl and disagree with a little bit with Mark for a second. There aren't 20% of Americans who are available to both parties. At the beginning of the Obama campaign, we did the largest ethnographic study of American voters, and we followed 100,000 Americans for a month of their life, 24 hours a day, to figure out how they process information. And what you figure out is there's only about 8 to 9% of Americans who are really available to both parties. They'll say they're available to much bigger numbers say they are, but only 8 or 9% really can go back and forth, which is why Carl and I always call it 45, 45, 9, or 10. And then the other thing is the average swing voter is now a single mother with 2.6 jobs. Right? And you look, and they process information, they think about politics 4 minutes a week. And in that process, I do agree with what Mark said, it's almost all economic. It is who can make our kids' lives better. It is who's going to fight for me on our side. The winner of who will fight for a better economy has won the last 6 American presidential elections. And so if Democrats, and Neera is exactly right, I do not believe Bernie Sanders can do both those things to win a general election. But Carl is waking up every morning and praying to Jesus that we nominate him.
Well,
Confirmation!
no, look, here's my point. I agree with you. This battle is being fought out. Are you going to be focused on electing somebody, or are you going to be a true believer? And I see that battle being fought out. I agree with you. I'm not certain I agree that 61% define electability in the same way that the two of you do, which is we got to get somebody like Bernie, or excuse me, like not Bernie, like Joe, who can unify the country.
Yeah,
I think some people.
It's an open question.
I think some people say to themselves, the best person who can beat Trump is somebody who thinks like I do. But my point, I don't write the headlines for my column. My message was more, you better take him seriously. And you better have a campaign of persuasion, because whether it's Mark's 20% or Jim and my 10%, if you go into the general election and all you're doing is talking to the 45%, and Bernie's over there talking to his 45%, and nobody's really talking to the 10%, the guy who is running against the incumbent is more the candidate of change. And you may have some of that 10% that says, neither one of these people is talking to me, I'm staying home, or I'm throwing my vote away for Coffee Man, or I'm throwing my vote for the Libertarian. And who gets their base energized more? Both of you made my point. Whose base was more energized in the 2018 midterms?
Democrats.
The Democrats. And the Republicans had better wake up and realize that that's not going to change between now and 2020 all by itself. And we had presidential level turnout among Democrats in 2018 and not among Republicans. And next time around, Trump's problem is a 2-to-1 problem. He may have reasonable, his reelect may be sort of where Obama was at this point in 2011, but the people who are definitely for Trump are outnumbered by almost 2-to-1 by the people who are definitely not Trump.
Yeah.
And he has got to run a campaign of persuasion that says not only here's what I've done, but more importantly, here's what the next chapter is, and here's why this person over here is not as worthy as I am to have the office for the next 4 years.
So let me kind of jump in with a couple of things. First, I bashed Bernie Sanders too. So I'm going to be on that side of the stage. And look, I think Biden is leading because he is a more centrist moderate Democrat, and the centrist moderate Democrats, who are most of the people in big states, have been omitted from the media discussion. I think number one, you have to realize Donald Trump did not win with a base strategy. Donald Trump won because he took Democratic voters who voted for Barack Obama in the Midwest and converted them. And the math of converting swing voters, think of a 5-5 election. You convert one swing voter, it becomes 6-4. It's very powerful. If you add a voter, it has only half the mathematical power. And so he converted Barack Obama voters. There are two basic swing groups. Suburban voters, particularly women, who traditionally are what I call the closet conservatives of America. They pretend they're more liberal, and then they vote Republican. In, I think, the midterms here, a lot of them switched over to Democrat for the first time. And the working class, and can Trump win those back? I don't see Trump doing anything right now that wins those voters back as of today. And the second group is the working class voters who Trump really bonded with in a very strong way, and he spends all his time trying to keep them in what he's created as a different Republican Party, where he took issues of trade and immigration and completely flipped around the policy positions in a way that no one had before. And that was the key to his victory. But right now, if I were to say Trump's problem is 57% approve of the way he is managing the economy, and if you ask a simple question, do you like Donald Trump, the answer is 29%. And his job approval, 45, is the average of those two questions. So his problem isn't his performance. By the way, when I worked with Clinton, his performance was always 6 points better than his personality. And if you followed Barack Obama, it was reversed. His personality always led his performance or how people agreed. But I've never seen a president with that kind of gap between likable and performance. And that is what makes him virtually an uphill battle for re-election.
So the only thing I would add is I think we do have some data about these groups from the 2018 election because they did move. White non-college women, which had swung to Trump, actually moved back considerably, particularly in the Midwest. So issues like healthcare, pre-existing conditions, just as Jim said, protecting my kids and my family were really resonant with those voters. So these are a group of voters, a substantial number of voters who voted for Donald Trump in 2016 and then moved, particularly in a state like Michigan. Gretchen Whitmer wins by 8 points, 8 points. A lot of those voters moved away from Trump over the last 2 years. And I think the big question is, what is he doing to get those voters back? I think his goal on immigration is a fear message for some of these voters, and actually healthcare and pre-existing conditions in many parts of the country was an economic message that pulled them back. So, threatening the ACA seems to be a not winning strategy for re-election, but one he's pursuing nevertheless.
Yeah. There is a dichotomy there. Take a look at Arizona, for example. There's a state and a federal dichotomy. A well-known person is able to run in Ohio, for example, or Arizona with Doug Ducey, win a governorship, hold the governorship in Ohio, get reelected in Arizona, at the same time that you're losing Senate candidates who are more likely identified in the public mind with a chance to send a message to Donald Trump. What we had last time around was people who said, look, I'm living in suburban Chicago. I may like my Republican congressman, but the only thing I can do this year to send a message to Donald Trump is to vote for the Democrat. They're loaning their vote. They're not necessarily giving their vote, and they're up for grabs. I think Mark is absolutely right. That group is up for grabs. The group that's going to decide the 2020 election, if you had to pick just one.
They're up for grabs. How do you get them back, or get them to switch?
Well, the economy is the way, but you got to do three things. You got to talk in a disciplined fashion about what it is that you've done. You've got to talk in a disciplined fashion about what it is that you want to do. And you've got to then do what Jim did so effectively to Mitt Romney, and that's disqualify your opponent. And I think he'll do all right on the third one. I'm not certain about the first two just yet.
Let's talk a little bit about the Democratic primary battle, which I believe either you or your headline writers have said the Democratic primary from hell is headed our way.
Well, that was taken out of my column.
What are we in for?
Well, I'm not the Democrat, so
Yeah.
I think, yeah. So, but it was a brilliant column, I thought. First of all, let me just say I'm terribly disappointed that we're not going to have as big a primary on the Democratic side as I was hopeful of.
We have a picture of that too.
Yeah,
There's,
yeah.
there's a few more weeks.
On February,
We have a
no,
slide.
no.
We have a slide for that.
My greatest regret is now impossible to reverse. On February 12th, 2019, at the age of 96, Lyndon LaRouche died. So I was hopeful that he was going to be able to join this ticket and get this requisite number of donors and 1% in the national polls to participate in the debates, but apparently not. Look, I don't know what's going to happen in the Democratic primary, but I know it's all screwed up. One is they're starting earlier. Our first debate was in August. Their first debate is in June. Second of all, they're front-loading it. 4 years ago, between the 1st of February and the 3rd of March, they chose 24% of their delegates. This time around, they will choose 48% of their delegates or more in the first 4 weeks and 5 days of their primary process. Third, they have proportionality. We on the Republican side don't.
Yeah.
Marco Rubio got 17.7% of the Republican primary vote in Texas in 2016 and got 3 out of 155 delegates. If you get 15% on the Democratic side, you get delegates. And then finally, my personal favorite change is they may say they're the Democratic Party, but they're the only party in America with a House of Lords. They have superdelegates. They can't vote on the first ballot this time around, but imagine that on the second ballot, 755 unelected superdelegates, apparatchiks, donors, bundlers, past and current
that's me.
householders. Apparatchik, you're one, man.
Yeah, I am.
Yeah.
Mr. Apparatchik.
Yeah, so thanks, Carl, for your deep opinion about the Democratic primary. Let me just, some numbers matter here, right? First of all, don't believe any poll you see about either primary right now because they're all bullshit. And a reminder that 12 years ago, at the beginning of 2007, Hillary Clinton led Barack Obama at this date by 32 points, and Rudy Giuliani was 14 points ahead in the Republican primary. 4 years ago, Jeb Bush led the Republican primary by 6 points, and obviously we elected Donald Trump. So this thing's going to move back and forth a bunch. Carl's exactly right, though. We have changed the rules. Democrats have gone from 11 states that have caucuses, and in every caucus state, Bernie Sanders beat Hillary Clinton, to now only 3 real states having caucuses. The number 6, but now it's 3. We're going to open primaries, which is why you'll get more moderate voters in much bigger primaries. And we did front-load the calendar trying to get a nominee early. I think it's unlikely that will occur because of our 719 candidates. But actually, I think, and I think Neera thinks this is really good for the party, right? I think having a big contested primary with a bunch of people who we don't know, we can find some new stars. We should have this debate about the future of our party. It is good for the party. It's good for the country. And I think it'll strengthen the nominee. We beat Hillary Clinton in 2008, having to go to all 50 states. We won in the last night of the last primary. And we came into the general...
We won that primary.
Yeah, right. In South Dakota.
Yeah.
We went into the general election against John McCain, locked and loaded, ready to compete nationally because we'd gone to all 50 states. The Democrats will be stronger because this longer primary.
Yeah, and I would say the only thing I'd say is, first of all, it is not actually starting earlier than 8 years ago, because 8 years ago we had our first debate at the end of April, and now our first debate is, the first debate will be in June. I would agree that the large primary, there's really a question about a large primary when it comes to voters, right? So the question is, one of the concerns about a large primary is that the primary candidates will destroy each other. This was, in 2016, it was a pretty nasty Republican primary, and the person who seemed to be able to throw the most punches survived. I do think in the Democratic primary, and I think this happened in 2008, and my suspicion is it will happen in 2020, there will be a price paid by candidates who go too negative. Democrats are very focused on beating Trump. They are anxious about a nominee surviving the process. So, this is a prediction, but I actually think candidates that attack each other, that go after each other, personally, that wasn't sanctioned so much in 2016 because I think a lot of people thought Hillary was going to win. I think there was a social sanction, there was a voter sanction in 2007 when any candidate went too negative. When Hillary went negative or was perceived to be going negative, voters reacted negatively. When Barack Obama what was perceived to be going negative and likable enough and things like that, voters reacted sharply negatively. I think that is an important discipline to have. That didn't happen at all in 2016 in the Republican primary. I think it will happen in this primary because, again, people are so focused on winning, which will mean the primary process will do what it should do, which is have a strong nominee come out of the process.
Well, I think. Look, first, let me tell you a story about the very first poll I ever did. Was in, I think, summer of 1975, and my partner then, Doug Schoen, we were doing this poll, and I say, Doug, you got to stop this poll. It's all wrong. And he said, what's the matter? Well, I said, you left out one of the candidates running for the Democratic primary for president. He says, which one? I said, well, Jimmy Carter. He says, nah, forget about it. Right? And of course, Carter would have gotten only 1% in the poll. So Democratic voters through Democratic primaries have a habit of choosing somebody you don't expect in these long primaries when you do this far out. So that's one thing. If I were taking, so that's why I say being president is a low probability profession, and even the person with the highest probability has a low probability of the event occurring. Having said that, if I were going to pick out the single most probable event based on politics today, I would say that because of the proportional delegate system, you pretty likely you could wind up with a convention where Biden comes out first, Sanders, who I think will come back from these polls that are taken the day after the Biden announcement, comes in second. Harris gets a significant number of delegates between California and other states, and maybe Mayor Pete, right? And nobody has a majority. And in that convention, the question will be whether Sanders was robbed last time and should get it this time, or in fact Biden should get it because he's number one and he represents the mainstream of the party. That is the primary and convention from hell, if that's what happens.
I mean, just to state facts, Bernie Sanders wasn't robbed last time because Hillary won by 4 million votes.
You say that now.
Right? I said he was
I mean, I do
safe.
think when you win by 4 million votes, it's not
from
robbed.
us.
Yes, I know it is definitely a Trump tactic, a conservative tactic to keep that argument going. But there are facts.
Just goes to show delusion is shared among both parties.
All right.
I'm aware of that.
So to Neer's point of there is a voter penalty for going too negative in the primary. Do you all agree with that? No.
No.
It's
No,
gonna,
In fact, I think that leaves out something. Yeah, there may be a minor penalty among some do-gooders, but I think that is more than offset by the contrary impulse, which is who sings to my heart? Who's got the message that conforms to my view of what a Democratic Party ought to be? And I'm with Mark. I think the Democratic Party is not as sort of out there as it gets portrayed. It is a more centrist, a more traditional liberal party, which is why I think that somebody who says Medicare for all is going to appeal to the activist base, but the person who says repair and strengthen the Affordable Care Act is going to appeal to the broader universe of Democrats. The question is, you take those first 4 weeks and 5 days of primaries and caucuses, and who's going to be voting in those states? And when you drop California in there,
And Texas.
well, and Texas has got a more, because of the Hispanic population, got a more centrist Democratic Party, but California is not as centrist as Texas is. So when you have Massachusetts, California, Minnesota, a bunch of these parties that tend to be a little bit more liberal, what's going to happen?
But I mean, Hillary won California's primary last time, and,
Right.
and with Bernie Sanders very, very strong in the primary. So I
But
actually think
you
the
can't,
sense
you
of
can't
this.
compare a two-person race against the roller derby you're going to have now.
I'm only pointing out that if you actually think that there is an overwhelming group in California of actual voters, that I think a lot of people were surprised that Hillary won the California primary last time because the presumption was California was so much more liberal than other states. And I actually think you're seeing this right now. The candidates in Iowa, people are actually getting up close and seeing all of these candidates. And I agree with everyone that these early polls are not predictive of the final results. Candidates will be able to go through the debates, and people will see them on that stage and imagine them as president, which will be a new experience. But I also think that one of the reasons why there's so much fluidity in the race is because essentially people aren't choosing because they're trying to see who can get through the process, and that itself will determine electability. But electability is still the central issue, much more than any, I mean, Carl is right. In most Democratic primaries, having a candidate that agrees with you on the issues is 65, 70% of voters' views. But now it's 50-50, some polls 60, saying, I prefer a candidate who can win, who disagrees with me a lot of the time. That is very unusual, and I think it's fueled by the fact that Trump is in office, and people look at this whole broad array of 20 Democrats and say, I would take any one of those people over Donald Trump.
Yeah, but I think they're confused. I don't think they're sitting here saying, God, I've got this all figured out, and I've just got to, who's the most electable? Right now, they're trying to figure out who are all these people.
Yeah.
Who is the weird mayor that seems to have the buzz? Is it Buttigieg? Buttigieg?
He's not a weird mayor. What is that?
Yeah. So
You're so mean, Rose.
I know.
Look,
It's ridiculous.
I'll tell you why Buttigieg gets under my skin. Guy comes up to me and says at Fox News Sunday, which he did a very impressive job, I thought.
Yeah,
he shows up to me and says, "Oh, nice to see you, Carl. You were so nice to me when I met you at the Institute of Politics. Oh, like 10 years ago." And I'm thinking, how old do I feel when the guy says to me, I enjoyed meeting you when I was a student at Harvard. And you were a really old guy.
All right, let's dish on the candidates since you all have gone down that path.
Yeah, and look, let's not get her started on the Bernie thing going here with the recent newspaper article. Did you see it, Bernie?
I love all the Democratic candidates equally.
Let me come back to your point about negative in the primaries. I think the reason that Donald Trump is here is because all of the other Republican candidates thought Donald Trump was so weak that they would just get behind him and wait for him to collapse and then pick up their voters. So they never stopped him. And the truth is, if you don't stop a phenomenon, and we in 2008 were very late with like the 3 a.m. ad that was very effective, but it was too late. Barack Obama was a phenomenon who took off, right? And so you start with a number of candidates with obvious probabilities, right? And then the question is, will somebody like Mayor Pete, doesn't look like Beto, will be that kind of, but if there's a phenomenon, they rocket up. And if you don't stop the phenomenon early, you never get to stop them late. And that's the experience of Donald Trump, Barack Obama, every phenomenon that comes out of these primaries. So if the establishment candidates want to win, they're going to have to attack and stop anyone from coming up. So I predict a fairly brutal primary, but I think it'll have no effect on their ability to win. And I also think that electability, while it polls well, the people always say that the candidate who's strongest, who represents their views, is the most electable one by definition.
There's one element
Not
that,
where they are.
I don't agree
That's
with
not where
anything
they
there.
there's one element that was present in the 2016 Republican primary that I don't think is present in the Democratic primary this time around, and it's helpful to the Democrats that it's not there. The Republican Party was so angry, some elements of the Republican Party were so angry at the perceived treatment of the country and of them by President Obama and his administration, that all they cared about was who's the guy who's going to take a brick and throw it through the plate glass window. Who shares my anger at the direction of the country and is tired of being looked down to by Obama and is going to get the brick and just throw it. And Trump appealed to those people. And I don't see that there's that same, I mean, yeah, they don't like Trump, but it's not like they're looking for somebody that represents them that will solve the problem. It's just not this blind anger of who is tough enough to stand up and take the brick. I think that's why Biden's comments, while they've been, I thought, pretty tough on the president, were not the kind of over-the-top stuff that we saw from Trump in 2016, because he understands the Democratic Party wants somebody who's going to stand up to Trump, but they don't want to emulate that same tone that he had either in 2016.
So I think the only quick point I'd make to that, which is slightly different, is I do think Democrats and Republicans are different in their attitude towards governing, and it really believing in a government role. So I think Democrats are as angry, if not angrier, at Donald Trump than, or I mean, maybe equally angry as Republicans were at Obama. In fact, it is the uniting force within the Democratic Party. I mean, Democrats, liberals wake up every day and feel that Donald Trump, they wake up in fear about what he's tweeted and how he's affronted their values. But I do think they actually also believe in governing and having a president who can govern because they believe in a government that solves problems. So it's not enough to just be the angriest candidate. You do have to make a case of why you will be the best president to Democrats. And I do think Republicans believe less in government, so they're more open to outside actors being a president than Democrats were. I mean, Andrew Cuomo was heavily reelected in the primary in a very liberal state because I think actually liberals believe that the job of governing is hard and you need some experience.
Well, you wanted to jump in earlier.
No, we'll keep going.
Keep going. So we always come back to the character issue. What does, and Nero, to your point of not optimizing the outrage, if you will, what does the character issue look like today when norms and standards have been completely eviscerated?
I mean, I think that the singular issue of character that Democrats are looking at, I think most of them will pass this, is someone who tries to unite the country, who stands up to the bullying. I think Democrats, liberals, progressives all think the president's divisiveness, the attacking minority groups, the fomenting of, xenophobia, basically bullying people, all of those things unites the party in opposition to that. So from Biden to Bernie to Warren, all the candidates find that incredibly offensive. I thought it was actually really smart of Joe Biden to really take Charlottesville on, because that is the singular issue of deep offense within the Democratic Party, that you would have a president who would have that kind of response. And so I think that is the base character issue that defines Democrats.
By the way, what did the rest of you think about the Joe Biden video?
I thought it was pretty good. And I don't want to ruin her reputation, but I think she was right that by picking out Charlottesville, that was a smart move on his part. And you'll notice you cannot look at Joe Biden and hear him saying deplorables. You can't look at Joe Biden and hear him say clinging to their guns and their religion, because he is middle America. Scranton, PA. He's a little goofy, a little bit too hands-on, but.
You've been waiting, admit it, you've been waiting to demo that line.
Yeah.
Not recently, but we're reformed.
But look, I recommend a book to you. It's about a critical American election. I think I did a hell of a job with it myself. But we have politics that's broken today like it was in the Gilded Age, and along comes a guy who says, I'm going to unify the country. And he is an unusual Republican because he says the Republican Party is open not simply to white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, but if you're an immigrant and an ethnic minority, I welcome you into our party. He's the first presidential candidate of any party to actively appear in public in front of black groups and say, I welcome your support, I ask for your support. And most important of all, he is a Civil War veteran who ends a 25-year period where the North and the South are still fighting by inviting 2,000 Confederate veterans of the campaigns in the Shenandoah Valley, the men on the other side of the guns who are trying to kill him, and invites them to Canton, Ohio, and says, if we ever fight again, and God forbid that we shall fight as brothers under a common flag. And literally, people in America, it's hard for us to understand this today, are weeping at the sight of these Confederate veterans and the Union War veteran healing the country. And, I thought Biden's remarks were most important when he talked about bringing the country together, because when our politics is broken, that's what they want to hear from their political leaders.
Yeah.
Now, whether they actually do it or not, they want to hear that. And I think even the president got this, because he tried to say that in the State of the Union address. We got to find common purpose. We're meeting today to discuss the infrastructure program. There's a recognition, I think, at some level in both sides, at Biden and I think inside the political operation surrounding the president, of the system is broken, and that 10% to 20%, they want to see it work. Now, How that's going to play out over the next year and a half, God only knows.
So, I mean, I think that really Biden's thing obviously struck a good chord. He basically talked about the values of America. He stayed away from the issue specifics and whether he's for Medicare for all or health care for all or health care for more. And so I think that was a very kind of smart announcement. Now, in terms of the character issue, I would just say that I was looking at this poll, and I do a monthly Harvard-Harris poll, and it's all publicly released. You can see it. And so I look at this list of character attributes for Trump, and I look at it, and it's the most horrible thing I've ever seen. 57% say the guy is vulgar. And it all goes downhill from there, dishonest, et cetera. So I'm getting, well, how could 40% in my 40-40-20 country really cheer the guy if that's his character? And there were two things left out. One, taking on the powerful forces of Washington, and two, keeping the promises he made to people. And those two, for the 40 to 45% that approve of him, outweigh the 20 other characteristics. And to understand that, you have to understand that's the only way that could happen.
But do you
and he has two attributes that no one else had in the last 20 years, and he's got 10 attributes that no one else had either.
But Mark, do you think that that's actually, I mean, I think the issue here is, is the issue Trump and then the characters follow them? Because, I mean, is it just that we have so much tribalism and they're, and he has a 40% base and they don't like him on all these other issues, but because he's a Republican and he sticks it to the other side, these are the two ways that they articulate that they like him, but it's really actually, they just support Trump. I mean, what is the issue? Is it the character, or is it actually just they like Trump because Trump sticks it to Democrats?
I'm going to let a Republican answer this question.
Well, let me step back. This sort of assumes that we trust our politicians, and we don't. And I think people are looking at these. Look, Joe Biden, Mr. Plagiarist, forced out of a presidential campaign because he was found to be plagiarizing Neil Kinnock's speeches. So nobody's looking at these people and saying they're saints. Remember, they voted for this guy in 2016, weeks after the Access Hollywood tape. And why they voted for him is if you were part of the 32% of the electorate that thought the country was going in the right direction, you voted for him, you voted for her 88-8. If you were part of the 65% of the country that thought that America was going in the wrong direction, you voted by enough for him to give him the victory. And the challenge he's going to face next time around is he going to still be the candidate who is working on behalf of change, because people do not think today the country is going in the right direction. Now, it's interesting. It's, they got lots of different reasons why. We shouldn't assume that they're the prescriptions of either party. They just have a sense that the country is broken, that the economy is not serving the ordinary family.
It's still 60% wrong track.
Carl's point is really important, though, about Trump. Democrats could be really careful on this character issue, because Donald Trump is like free beer for Democrats. We can wail away on him every day. We get two great things: money on the internet and free press. It's just amazing. But in the end, like Carl did to Kerry, like we were able to do to Romney, they'll pull the Democratic nominee down to a reasonable number. And if it's a character contest, it'll be a jump ball here. Democrats have got to stay focused on an economic argument that wins persuadable voters and excites our voters. And Donald Trump makes it really hard, because every day on his Twitter feed, he says crazy things that make us want to kill ourselves, and we all race over there. And we've just got to stay focused on the big picture stuff. And that is really hard when you're running against a madman with orange hair.
Yeah. Well, and look, it's not just the Democrats aren't helping themselves by all the talk of impeachment.
But the candidates aren't talking about impeachment.
Well,
No,
I know
Pelosi's
they can't, but look, here's the deal. It caught me in the Washington Post ABC poll. Democrats want to impeach Trump. Republicans don't want to impeach Trump. Independents after the Mueller report now break by better than 60%, saying it's over, no impeachment. So the Democrats have got two problems here. One problem is all this talk about investigations inflames the base of the Republican Party, Trump's supporters, and it doesn't impress the 6 out of 10 independents who say, it's over, that's done, Mueller settled it for me, move on. Now let me finish. The second problem is that who can tell me what kind of legislation the House Democrats are passing? Nobody. Because all we're talking about is the latest, Jerry Nadler, Adam Schiff, Maxine Waters, Clyburn, Solwell, you name it, coming out saying, we got to investigate that son of a bitch. And that's not going to help the Democrats if that's what the next year is about.
Okay, you finished, right? You're on.
We have 20 candidates running for president. 19 are not supporting for impeachment. I mean, I think when you actually go out and hear what they're saying, I think you're totally right. House Democrats are, unfortunately, they've passed a gun bill, they've passed healthcare bills. No one's paying attention. Washington doesn't pay attention. That's really much more of a function that Trump consumes the media, and nothing else gets attention. But the candidates themselves are actually in their town halls talking about issues. They talk rarely about Trump. They talk rarely about impeachment. And impeachment comes up rarely from voters. Yeah. And I think that's a healthy feedback loop, actually. Mm-hmm. The candidates are actually talking about issues because that's what matters to voters.
Well, I wish the committee chairman would bring back the 85 subpoenas they sent out. But because I agree with Carl, this is not about impeachment. This is an election that has to be won on values, and we have to have an economic defensive message. And Trump is facing the reverse. He has to have an economic offense, and he has to cover himself on values. And those are probably the things running. I just leave you with this one pessimistic thought, right? Which is that, 45% approve of the president. About 39% approve of the Republican Party. About 42% approve of the Democratic Party. Right? So between the president, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, and about 20% approve of Congress. So the biggest reason why people say the country's in the wrong direction, despite unparalleled economic prosperity, is that they don't have faith in the Democrats, the Republicans, the president, or the Congress. And that's the problem.
Hell of a deal.
Well, now that we've cleared all that out and the road to 2020 is laid out ahead of you, straight and predictable, Mira, Carl, Mark, Jim, thank you very much.